Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning into this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Melina Cordero. Melina was an ambitious woman, breaking glass ceilings and collecting accolades in a male-dominated industry. But behind closed doors, she was overworked, unfulfilled, and doing things that weren't aligned to her values. Now, she's launched her own company and working within her truth. Let's go check out her story. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Melina Cordero. Melina is a strategy consultant and founder of Melina Cordero Consulting. Now, she figured out the way we work isn't working, so she's on a mission to change it and help others in the process. Now, I learned of her after she was featured in Rebecca Knight's Business Insider article about McKinsey and Lean In's 2022 Women in the Workplace report. Now, if you haven't read it, I highly suggest that you do so. I'll be sure to link to it in the comments. And so, Melina, welcome aboard. How you doing?
I'm great, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think these are important conversations to have and share.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you joining me today. And so prior to us really discussing, how you pivoted during the pandemic, would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and really where you call home.
Sure. So I'll start, I was born in Washington, D.C., grew up outside Washington, D.C., and then later in New Jersey. What I would say about my upbringing that I think is most important or shaped me the most is really having a sort of bicultural household, right? So my father is Puerto Rican and also came from a very working class background, right? Parents were factory workers, grandparents were sugarcane farmers, right? So that was one side of my home. And the other side of my home came from my mom's side, which is, she's white, grew up in Washington, D.C., different economic circumstances. So I grew up with two parents who had very different backgrounds. And so I was exposed to really different ways of living and being and thinking. And I think that was a really big part of my upbringing. They're not conformists, so I grew up with a little bit of that encouragement to ask questions and think differently and question things. But regardless, I grew up, a very good little girl, always did well in school, was on the straight and narrow, didn't get in trouble, went to Yale, did all the things. It wasn't until later that I started to rebel a little bit.
Okay. No, very nice. And now what are some of the things that you've been passionate about professionally?
Oh my goodness, so many things. And that was part of my challenge starting in college because I was interested in so many things. But I've always loved cities and I've always loved this idea of building places and communities where everybody is welcome. I love diversity. And the big thing that I've always been obsessed with in all the different sort of jobs and careers I've had is learning and research. So a lot of my roles have focused on really digging into data and information and the latest findings about things and then helping people, make decisions off of that. So I've always been obsessed with research and teaching, I would say.
So you love going down the rabbit hole. So and I remember when you and I initially connected, I was like, oh, woman after my own heart. I love it. We just dig a little deeper, right? So
I live in the rabbit hole and I love it there. So join me whenever you want.
Absolutely. And now prior to launching your own company, tell us a little bit about your work journey and what's worked well in some of the environments that you've been a part of.
So my work journey was so accidental. I think so often people thought I had this very, straight and narrow plan, and I did not. I graduated wanting to do one thing, but I graduated, graduate school in 2011, or we were still very much a recession. I was abroad, and I just took the first job I could get. And from that point, I knew it was in market research, right? It was just like an analyst position somewhere. But from that point on, I ended up climbing up the corporate ladder very, very accidentally. And by the age of 28, I was this, managing director in a massive global commercial real estate firm. I was sort of this golden child in a lot of ways in this corporate environment that was mostly white, mostly male, mostly older. And I was a sort of star rising up, whatever they call it, in this very corporate environment. I was doing that.
Yeah. And how was that being in that space? And you said you kind of got there accidentally, but was there something about specifically, commercial real estate that you really enjoyed that really got you?
It's a good question. I did enjoy lots of aspects of it, right? It was challenging. It was interesting. It was dynamic. I worked really hard. But I think, a lot of the things that led me to success in those roles and in those environments were things that were not good for me. So, for example, my perfectionism, my hard work, that work ethic, the needing to constantly, do more and do better and keep climbing, right? Like those things, plus professionalism, right? It was very professional all the time, buttoned up and don't show emotion, right? And so there were all these things that I was able to do that led me to success, but which felt, as you mentioned in your introduction a little bit, didn't really feel like me, didn't feel aligned. So the question's an interesting one, right? The things that led me to be successful in these environments actually made me really tired.
And we're definitely going to explore that a little bit too. But before we get there, I would love to, look, the show is about the Great Resignation, right? We kind of got our origin in this space. And so I want to take you back to March of 2020, where COVID really hits us, and the pandemic as we know it now started. So talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected you.
Oh my gosh, it affected me. I mean, just like it affected everybody else in different ways. But my initial reaction was relief, which says a lot. So
yes,
I remember at the time I was in a role where I was traveling constantly, right? I was on the road every week. I was speaking at conferences. I was running between stages and boardrooms and Ubers and flights. And I was always on the move. I was never home. Always tired. And I remember when there were inklings of this pandemic thing coming and, maybe there was this big conference that we had to go to every year that I dreaded going to it was just too much. And it was on the other side of the country and I really didn't want to go. And I remember going, oh my gosh, I hope they cancel it. Oh my gosh, I hope they cancel it. And they did. And I just remember this huge sense of relief. And then, all of these other trips got canceled. And I just remember feeling like, oh, thank goodness. I mean, that said something to me, right? The fact that I couldn't do what I was usually having to do. I was like, I'm pretty happy not doing that. That says something, right? So I'd say that was my first initial response to it. And my day-to-day radically changed, right? Because if I was on the road all the time, I was constantly at conferences, I was going to meetings, and all of a sudden I was just home on my own. It was quiet. That's a very different day-to-day.
Definitely. And what were some of the things that you started to learn during this time?
I just started to notice things. You start to notice things that you don't really see before when you're always running around. And I think the most striking thing I noticed was, I knew I was tired. I knew I was, burning the candle at both ends or whatever the expression is. But I didn't realize everybody else was too. And so one of the fascinating things that happened during the pandemic we can all relate to, right, is as all of a sudden everyone's home, everyone's dealing with all these things and their kids are home and their partners and parents, and we're on Zoom now, so we can see into each other's homes. We're seeing people walk in the background. So all of a sudden we sort of lifted the veil on our sort of more personal lives, and we got to see each other a little bit more, and getting a little bit more intimate in that way with people who were colleagues and clients and things like that. I realized a lot of people aren't very happy. They're stressed. They're tired. This is hard.
No, definitely. And, that's a great point about we heard about this with Zoom and Teams or whichever your platform was. The ability to see into someone's home offered a level of insight that even the employee necessarily didn't want to give, Not every platform was comfortable with you having backgrounds and all these other things and blurring things out. And so you got to peer into certain aspects of people's lives that sometimes they may not have wanted to share. Right. And so I think I'm glad that you raised that.
I think the other thing, speaking of Zoom, that at least for me, my experience, because I was in an environment where a lot of times I was the only woman on a call, right? And that's one thing when you're in a meeting room or conference room, you're sort of there. But when you're on a Zoom meeting and you're seeing every face in the meeting on your screen and you realize, oh, everybody's the same color, or, oh, these are all men, or, oh, they're all from this part of the country, right? Like, you become a lot more aware of visually, oh, everybody looks the same, right? So I think that was interesting for me too, to really notice that for the first time. I mean, we know, but to really see it on your screen is striking.
No, definitely. And now speaking about your industry, former industry, right? So commercial real estate was really hit hard during this time. And hell, I mean, I think it's still probably trying to recover right now. And so how did you change the way you worked during the shutdowns, given the industry that you were in?
It's interesting because I don't know if I changed fundamentally the way I worked. I think I just had to do a lot more of it. So my role, I was a leader, but I was also a thought leader, right? So a lot of my job was giving the information about what was going on in the market to clients and to my colleagues, my teams, so that they could succeed. And now all of a sudden we're in this environment where nobody knows what's happening and nobody certainly knows what's going to happen. And my job is to tell people what's going to happen so they can make good decisions. It was a really interesting exercise in leadership, right? In that experience of how do you lead through really uncertain times? And a lot of people have written a lot of things about this, but it was interesting to really hold that space for my clients, for my colleagues and teams and saying, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. And having to be really humble with the reality of we don't know these things. We can't make it up. So there was a lot of defending facts and that kind of thing that happened during that time.
Oh yeah, for sure. And now how did the pandemic really start to affect your relationship with your job and how you were treated on the job?
Yeah, I mean, it affected my relationship with the job in some of the ways that I mentioned, right? I started to sort of look a little bit more critically because I had the time and the space. I wasn't just running around in survival mode trying to get to my flight or get home. But also it definitely, with 2020, we had a pandemic, but we also had what I would call a relatively major awakening on the sort of social racial justice front among companies, at least on the surface, right? For a lot of them, in realizing, we have to respond to this. We need to be cognizant. We need to be doing something about this diversity thing, right? And so in my industry, in the industry that I worked in, which has historically not been diverse in gender or in race, there was a big push to diversify. And so what that meant for me is all of a sudden I found myself being one of the only women at my level in my department was a lot more requests to participate in these client facing webinars and things. And I started getting asked to participate in more committees and more presentations, which was obvious that the company was sort of saying, well, we can't just put a bunch of white men on a screen, right? We need to have diversity. And so all of a sudden I had, on top of the added responsibility of leading during a pandemic, leading, kind of representing women in a lot of things that actually had very little to do with my role.
I saw you got assigned to the diversity committee in 2020. And so tell us a little bit about, those origins and your response and what that even meant.
I mean, I got assigned to so many diversity committees, right? Or initiatives. And within each initiative, there would be, I would get invited in to be on the committee for deciding awards for XYZ. And I was sort of expected to be help us find, women candidates or help us find XYZ. And this is a big thing. I've done a lot of interviews and a lot of research with people of color and women in corporate workplaces who have taken on these responsibilities or are asked to do, diversity committee work. And in the beginning are excited because it's aligned with how we want to impact and change things. And in the end get very frustrated because we realize either there's not really a strong desire to change things, and there's a lot of frustration that goes with that. So I actually know a lot of people in similar positions who were sort of pulled into these roles, but let's be real, they're unpaid. It's extra responsibility. And the number one thing also is that we're not qualified, right? Just because you're a woman, just because you're a person of color, it doesn't mean that you have expertise in recruitment, retention, management, right? So there's this false assumption that, you should just know how to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work because you were born this way, right? And that's extremely difficult because we don't have time, in managing our day jobs and to go on the side and try and learn these things. So that's a big misstep so many companies make.
Yeah. And that's a great point you raise. And I hear a lot about that too. The money piece for sure. And a lot of times you say this is extra work, and the extra work, the type of work that it is also like emotionally impacting type of work. And so folks are like managing this. They don't have the resources. They don't have, to your point, even the qualifications potentially, and things just start compounding. And so I've heard a lot of folks kind of burning out in these spaces relatively quickly.
100%. The number one thing, and I've heard such heartbreaking stories too from people, especially employees of color who I do interviews with. Really, the number one thing they say is it's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. And I know a lot of companies, organizations, and leaders aren't aware of how exhausting it is, the impact psychologically and emotionally being an underrepresented person in a space truly is.
Right. No, without a doubt. And so looking back on the pandemic as, I guess we're still kind of in it, right? But just kind of looking back on these past couple of years, what is one thing you would have done differently during this time?
I would have spoken up more. I would have rocked the boat. I think, as I mentioned before, what I believe made me so successful in my various corporate positions was my ability to, get the job done, do well, and, provide some new ideas and innovation without rocking the boat too much. If I could go back and change things, I would have, especially during the pandemic, spoken up a bit more. I think there was just such a big push to do business as usual, and some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives they were doing. Like, I really would have spoken up more and said, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think this is the right approach. Or I would have advocated more for myself and saying, look, this isn't a good use of my time. I respect your desire to diversify representation on X, Y, or Z call, but it's going to impact me in this way. I would have spoken up more, I think. Now, you could debate that if I had done that, I wouldn't have got as far as I did, right? You could argue that, but I do look back and wish that I had spoken up more and said, this isn't equitable.
No, that's good. And I always love hearing those type of reflections now that we're kind of in this time now. And I don't want to say coming out of it, but we are in a much different place than we were, at the height. And so now look, we transitioning into, the role that you were in. You're in this last company for around 5 years, and keep me honest here, but you decided to resign in March of 2021, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
I mean, lots of reasons, right? The personal reasons, right? As I mentioned, a year or 2 years or however long it was at that point, being at home and realizing that I would rather be in lockdown in my apartment than doing the job I was doing before. That's a bit of a red flag, right? But ultimately, what it really was is I didn't feel that I was making an impact in the role that I was doing. I didn't think I was making an impact on the world, but I also didn't think I was making an impact really in my organization either. I was making great money. I was getting awards. I was climbing up, but I didn't feel like I was actually doing anything of impact. And when we're in a context where the world is changing radically in so many ways, to be sort of sitting there and just like kind of collecting, what is it, like the Monopoly board, like collecting money every time I passed go, I was like, I need to feel that I'm impacting something more.
No, that's great. And so thinking about that decision, like obviously the lead up and actually making the call, how did it impact you to make that decision when you did it?
It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. I mean, everything that anybody who quits a job goes through, right? Is like financially, what am I going to do? And I can't leave my job, and I couldn't leave this. And what are people going to say? And I think one of the biggest adjustments too is, my job was my identity for so long. I was the corporate superstar rising up. I was going to do this and that, and I was respected, and people respected me because of my position. And so a lot of my identity was wrapped up in that role. And so there was a lot of fear of, oh my gosh, when I give this up, who am I? And are people still going to want to work with me? Are people still going to want to be my friend? Right? It sounds crazy, but I don't think it is. I think so many people in our society, for sure, our identities are wrapped up with our roles, our jobs. So that was hard and scary.
Oh, definitely. And so what has happened since you left?
All sorts of things. Since I left, I mean, my life has changed. It's been an amazing journey, hard at times, easy at others. But the biggest takeaways for me are, the fact that people still liked me. I'm still me, right? And actually it brought a lot of people closer, people who were colleagues, people who were clients who really respected me for the decision I took and who reached out to me and said, you know what, I really, really feel everything that you're saying. And I wish I could do the same thing. And thank you for doing this, right? And so it actually When you start to live, I mean, this is going to sound a little woo-woo, but when you start to live your life aligned with what you believe in and what you care about, it really does draw people towards you, the right people.
No, that's great to hear. And, look, and I mentioned how I initially learned about you, right? I found you through this Business Insider article, but I'm curious, what's been the reaction to the story, and really what are your thoughts about Lean In's 2022 Women in the Workplace report?
So many thoughts. Well, I would say the reaction is, unsurprisingly, so many women saying, yes, your story is my story. Yes, I resonate. Yes, everything you said or Stacy said or Sarah said, right? We're just representatives of a much larger group of people who are unhappy with the workplace, with the status quo, with how things are going. And I think that's exactly what the Women in the Workplace study shows. In my view, it shows two things. The first is it's not working. We're not where we need to be when it comes to gender diversity, also race diversity, right? We're not where we should be. Progress has slowed. It has not accelerated. And the second thing that the report really emphasizes is we're going through a big breakup, because the report addresses women, but I think this also applies to employees of color and other underrepresented groups. We're realizing that we're talented and that we have options, and we're exercising those options. And we're realizing that we don't have to be attached to a company anymore, or a company that we don't want to be attached to, or an organization. Given the way the labor market and the economy has evolved, there's so many more options now. And organizations and companies can't really afford to be kind of doing business as usual anymore, because people are breaking up with them.
Yeah. And keep me honest on the number here, but if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw a stat that was like, of the small businesses started in, I think it was 2021. What was it, like 45 or 49% were started by women?
Yes, it's about 50% were started by women. And although that doesn't sound striking, it's striking compared to the pre-pandemic levels, which were much, much lower. So generally pre-pandemic, something like maybe 30 or 40% of new businesses were founded by women. So the fact that it jumped up to 50 says a lot.
Yeah. So clearly, women leaders, are leaving companies, and, in your new role, you're focused on kind of changing the way we work. So tell us more about, Melina Cordero Consulting and the work that you do.
Yeah. So look, I left my job and started my company on the premise that the world is radically changed. 2020 changed the world fundamentally. And with that, we as humans, as individuals, as leaders, as employees also changed in terms of our needs and our priorities in life and in work. And I really believe that companies, organizations need to adapt to those new post-2020 needs in how they do business, in how they run their business, and how they operate. So what I do is I go in and I help companies, organizations understand what the new world looks like and what people need, and adapt to that. And so that can be everything from diversifying, creating more inclusive environments, changing your recruitment approaches, innovation, all sorts of things. But fundamentally, I'm helping organizations create workplaces and environments and structures for a post-2020 world.
No, that's great. What would you say was like your pivotal moment in starting your business?
My pivotal moment in starting the business was leaving my job. Definitely leaving my job. And there's this great metaphor that I heard recently that I think sums it up really well. So it's this idea of the trapeze artist, right? The trapeze artist is sort of flying through on one bar and wants to grab another bar, but has to let go of the first one in order to grab onto the next one. And I think so often, and I had wanted to leave for a long time, but I kept thinking, well, I can't leave until I have something else. I can't leave until I have something else lined up. I can't leave until I know exactly what the next step is. And it took me a long time to realize that I'm not going to know that next step until I leave this first one, right? And so there's a bit of a leap that has to happen. So in my view, honestly, my first step to building my company, and the biggest one, was leaving my last one, because you have to create that space to come up with the ideas, to have the clarity, to have the focus. And that's risky and scary, but that was my biggest step.
I love that. So that was your letting go of the first bar, if you will. Right?
I let go of the first bar, and you have to trust that there's another bar there. You have to trust.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, looking back at this whole process, right? The decision to leave, the pandemic, all of those things. Now you're in your new space. What have you learned about yourself throughout this process?
I am still learning so much every day, right? Because I think I hid behind this identity of my job, and that was who I was, right? That was the sum of me. And when you strip that away, you go, okay, well, who am I? And so it's been a learning process of, okay, this is what I love. This is what I'm good at. This is what I enjoy doing. And so I think my biggest takeaway is I'm more than my job. And even now, where I'm doing something I'm truly passionate about, I really enjoy, I'm more than just Melina, a business owner, Melina consultant. I am a friend. I'm a salsa dancer. I'm a reader. I'm a traveler, right? Like all of these different things make up me. And so my biggest takeaway, and I hope everyone can feel this throughout their life, is I'm more than my job.
I love that. And I just got to say, I know we're in season 2 here when we're recording this, but there's an episode in season 1 and the title is called "You Are More Than the Work You Do." And so Patricia Ming Buckley talks a lot about this. And so like for those who are listening, listen to this episode and then go listen to Patricia. It is, you all don't know each other, right? She's on the other side of the world, but it is so refreshing to hear you talk about this, because she mentioned some of those things as well. And so I'm glad that you're recognizing that and kind of, really owning it. And so now a part of the show that I love to get out there is really around the advice for others. And so for people who might be in a similar situation to yours, but maybe, they're unfulfilled or maybe they're burned out, really, they don't know what to do next. What are, let's say, 3 steps that they should take right now?
I have all sorts of things to say about this, in part because this is a teaser, but I'm building out a platform to help people quit their jobs. So 3 pieces of advice that I would give. One is talk to people who have done it. Make it real. Like listen. And I think your podcast is a great thing to start with, right? Listen to these stories, hear people who have done it, get your system to realize that it's possible. It's an option. That's number 1. Number 2, what I always say to people, and I've had some amazing mentors and teachers along the way who have taught me this, when you're burnt out, when you're exhausted, we often think that the antidote is rest. But I had a coach who told me, the antidote is not rest, it's fulfillment. So yes, rest is super important. It's pivotal. I rest a lot. But it's also really important when you want to counterbalance exhaustion and burnout with doing the things that make you happy, whether that's quilting or running or whatever it is, make room for that. Because there's this guy, I think he was like the chief happiness officer at Google or something, termed this idea of joy dots, where if you can just have little moments of joy throughout the day, when you string them together, it actually increases your happiness. So get yourself some joy dots. And then the third piece of advice is make an exit plan, even if it's just for play. Because I think a lot of times when we're in a position, whether it's a relationship or a job, and we feel stuck and you have more options than you think you do. And so sit down and say, okay, how much money do I actually need to be happy day to day? And list 50 ways that you could make money outside of your job right now. You could give English lessons. You could give Spanish lessons. You could list everything. And I'm telling you, it's an amazing exercise that makes you realize, oh, I'm not that stuck.
Right. There's a lot of good information out online, and specifically LinkedIn too, with this, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, about ways that you can bring in some extra income. If not, go out solely and do something on your own to make a, viable wage, but maybe something on the side that just allows you to get, to your point, that fulfillment. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And so now pivoting a little bit into the employer space. So what more do you think employers could be doing to better support employees? And in this case, specifically, let's talk about women in the workplace.
Yeah, there are so many things. I could talk for hours about the specific policies and approaches and initiatives. But I think that the one thing that I really want to emphasize is, and this applies for women, it applies for employees of color, it's do something, try and understand exactly what they're experiencing and how they're feeling. That's why the Women in the Workplace report is interesting, because it sort of brings to light exactly what the experiences are of these women, those quotes that you read and those experiences. I don't think that enough leaders and organizations are aware of what it feels like to be a woman in a male-dominated workplace, of what it feels like to be a Black man or woman or anyone in a mostly white environment, right? There's a lack of understanding. And because they don't understand that, they don't understand the urgency of changing it. And so I work with a lot of leaders and organizations that they're not making changes, not because they're bad people or they don't care, but because they're not aware of how unfortunate and unhealthy the situation actually is. And so I think the number one thing that organizations and companies and leaders can be doing is really understanding how their employees feel. And you can do that in lots of ways. External surveys, get a third party to come in. I do that too, and evaluate and really understand what's going on. How do people feel?
I like that. And now, as you think about this next chapter of your life, what type of impact are you hoping to have in this next phase of your professional journey?
I think, my big goal is to make work less uncomfortable prospects, make it a little more tolerable for everyone, right? And so for, what I've done for the past year, 2 years is helping companies make changes and adjust. But I'm really looking now at how can I expand that reach? How can I reach more people? And so what I'm doing and launching for next year is, rather than just focusing on companies, I really want to make this work accessible and this learning accessible to individuals, right? So anybody who is a leader or who's a rising leader who wants to learn, I want to be a leader that's ready for the post-2020 workplace, that can do things differently. Building out a platform that allows people to online, right, virtually, access that training and that learning in a really interesting environment. So I'm trying to expand access that people have to training, guidance, leadership, mentorship.
No, that's great. I love to hear that. Well, look, this was a great discussion, Melina. I just want to thank you for taking some time to speak with me today. Look, I found you, took a shot, reached out to you after seeing the article, and you're the, I will say this about Melina. Melina is the fastest response that I have ever received for an interview request. So you get the title, right?
Well, thank you. I mean, when I saw the podcast title and the mission, I was like, yes, perfect. More of that. So I'm glad we made it work.
No, definitely. And so would love for you to share with our listeners where they can connect with you.
Yes. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, and if the story resonates with anyone, please reach out. I love to help people make moves in their careers, in their lives. But you can go to my website, melinacordero.com. And I also encourage you to sign up for my newsletter. It's free. I'm not selling you anything, but that is where every 2 weeks or so, I really share new ideas about how to change the way we work, explore why do we work the way we do, everything from inbox zero to burnout, right? And so just sharing ideas and helping people realize you're not alone in questioning the way that we work.
Very good. All right. So thank you for that info. That'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Melina Cordero for joining us today. I'll be sure to share her information in our show notes along with the article that we've been referencing. So look, I hope you all have a great week and we'll see you next time. Melina, thank you so much again for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.